Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. Today we're going to get into a video that is maybe a little bit controversial, but it's over something that we went over the other day, which was how much of the world that Britain had invaded at one time or another, right? They gave a statistic on one of the videos I did the other day that seemed incredibly high to me. And so I decided that I was going to try to find another video on it. This one got recommended in the comment section, so we're going to jump into it. Every country England has invaded, visualized.
This video is made possible by CuriosityStream. For a good chunk of the past few centuries, this music was the final boss music played for people across the entire world. The English, and later the British, have been responsible for invading and conquering more countries and people than any other nation in human history. And honestly, it's startling just how many places they've been to. In this video, I'm going to do my best at attempting to visualize all of Britain's invasions and conquests for you, continent by continent, in as brief a time as possible. So let's begin with the closest continent to Britain, Europe. Ireland was the first target of British conquests and was invaded as early as 1169. Within 400 years of gradual conquests, the entire island was ruled by the British and remained that way until most of it was granted independence in 1921. Historically, France has probably been invaded by the English more times than any other country in the world. Just take a look at this huge list of invasions. There's not even enough time to talk about a third of these, and for a time, all of this territory inside of modern France was directly controlled by the English, with
Yeah, so this is one of the really interesting things about World War I to me. You have this long track record of the Brits and the French really hating each other. Then you have, even in more like modern times, you have the Napoleonic Wars that gets into the Congress of Vienna, and I know that France is treated as like a partner state in that, but also France had just tried to like overthrow Europe. So you have that situation happen, and then there's what, 100 years, not even, of like relative peace there. And then World War I breaks out. And so it seems a little bit like, I always hear, because we see Britain and France as just like lockstep allies today, right? The same way we do with like Britain and the US. There's kind of this revisionist history or like a misinterpretation of that relationship going back to the beginning of World War I. And I always say, it would have been very practical to me if Britain stays out of that conflict, if it's not specifically Germany. If it's not Germany and Germany is not the rival to the Brits that they are, or even if it is Germany and they just aren't that rival, right? They aren't quite as big, aren't, ramping up the Navy like they are. If Britain doesn't see Germany as the threat that it does, it would make total sense to me for Britain not to come fight with France. Why would it? I mean, the agreement for them to aid each other in wartime is, historians refer to it as basically a handshake deal or a piece of paper. Dan Carlin describes it as the paperwork that was signed for the treaty between Britain and France that would get Britain to go fight for France during World War I or at the behest of France in World War I. It has less overall paperwork than you would if you bought a house today. Like it's almost nothing that ties the two together. They have this long history of hating each other, and so it would have made total sense to me if, when France turns to Britain and says like, hey, you're going to come help, right? If Britain just turns to France and is like, no, why would we? Like, why do we need to get dragged into this?
Calais being the final piece that fell in 1557. Well, except for that time when the British took over Corsica for a couple years. The British continue to invade Spain by the millions every winter, but in the past, they've come with a lot less friendly intentions. English and later British soldiers invaded under the Black Prince in 1367 and continued on through the first, second, third, and fourth raids on Cadiz and that time when the British took over Gibraltar and Minorca. They gave Minorca back, but decided on keeping Gibraltar forever. In recent history, the British have invaded Belgium in order to support the Belgians, but that wasn't always the case. They conducted two pretty large-scale invasions of modern-day Belgium in 1654 and again in 1701, and Flanders itself was ruled by the English for a few years in the 14th century. The Netherlands was one of England's historical arch-rivals, and so there's been plenty of invasions going in this direction across the 17th and 18th centuries. In 1940, the British technically invaded and took over Iceland peacefully for a year in order to prevent it from falling into the hands of the Germans. But this was heavily protested by the Icelandic government at the time, so in my books it still counts as an invasion. Italy, of course, was invaded by the British Army during the Second World War as well in 1943, but there were plenty of invasions before then, dating back to Richard the Lionheart's invasion in 1190. Germany, too, was obviously invaded by the British Army in 1945, and northwestern Germany was occupied by the British for 3 years until 1948, but a lot of German territory was ruled by Britain long before then. The islands of Heligoland were British for most of the 19th century, and the Kingdom of Hanover was effectively ruled under a personal union for over a century between 1714 and 1837. Austria was also invaded in 1945, and the southwest of the country was occupied for a decade. Norway was invaded in 1810 and 1812 during the Napoleonic Wars when it was a part of Denmark-Norway because Denmark was aligned to France, so obviously Denmark was invaded during that time as well. Finland, Estonia, and Latvia were all briefly invaded by small units during the Crimean War against Russia because they were all part of the Russian Empire at the time, and of course.
So there are some, they haven't gotten to, obviously they haven't gotten to all of them on this list, but there are some that I think are more out of pocket than others. Like, the early invasions are really more just a testament to how long Britain has been around, or how long England has been around. Because everybody at that time is trying territorial expansion if they're strong enough. Most of those places just don't still exist within the same realm today. And so it's, you know, it's a different thing. So I feel like a lot of those early invasions especially, that's more a testament to how long they've been around versus what it looks like, that they just are invading everything. Because at the time period, that's what literally everybody would do if they had the strength and opportunity. They would massively expand as much as they could.
Of course, Russia itself was invaded then too, as well as in 1918 when the British took over a large chunk of northern Russia for a time in their fight against the Bolsheviks. The territory of modern Ukraine was invaded by British army units during the Crimean War. The British took over the Croatian island of Vis between 1807 and 1814 during their fight against Napoleon. The British army had boots and guns on the ground in Bosnia recently between 1992 and 95 fighting against the Bosnian Serbs, and around the same time the RAF also carried out bombing strikes against Serbian Serb targets in Serbia in 1999. Montenegro was briefly blockaded and invaded in 1930.
Serbian Serb targets?
During the First Balkan War, the British owned the westernmost Ionian islands of Greece between 1815 and 1863 before they gave them back, while Bulgaria was invaded and almost entirely occupied by the British Army between 1918 and 1919 at the end of World War I. Cyprus was a British protectorate between 1878 and 1914 when they decided to just outright annex it to piss off the Turks, and it remained annexed until 1960, except for two small chunks that are still British today. Turkey itself was massively invaded by the British during World War I, and part of it was occupied between 1919 and 1923.
In fairness, I mean, they kind of deserve that one.
That wraps up Europe, so let's move on to Asia next. Modern-day Israel and Palestine, as well as Jordan, were British-controlled from the end of World War I to 1948 and 1946, respectively. Lebanon and Syria were both occupied from the Vichy French government briefly during World War II. Iraq was ruled between 1919 and 1932 and invaded again during the Second World War and again in 1991.
No lie, this looks like a modern-day Roman Empire. Like, that's what this reminds me of. Because, you know, anything within reach was going to be Roman when the Romans were around, especially in their heyday. When, I guess, the sun was never setting on the Roman Empire. Anything within their reach was going to be theirs. And so you look up and you're like, okay, well, they've got Cisalpine Gaul. They've got Transalpine Gaul. Holy shit, Caesar's in Britain. Like, you know, they're all over the place. They're touching literally everything. All of the money and resources are flowing through there. Like, that's what this looks like as a modern day Roman Empire.
And again in 2003, Kuwait was a colony for over 60 years until 1966. Georgia and Azerbaijan were both invaded and occupied right at the end of World War I for a year. Iran has been invaded at least 3 times, with the most notable example being the joint Anglo-Soviet invasion of 1941.
Oil!
Turkmenistan was invaded in 1918 to prevent Bolshevik influence from spreading any further. Afghanistan is a favorite British invasion spot since it's been invaded in 1839, 1878, 1919, and again in 2001. Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman were all controlled by the British until the early 1970s, while a chunk of Yemen was controlled for over a century between 1839 and 1967. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka were—
Golly! They have the Middle East on lock, but then whenever you add Pakistan and India, that is a huge chunk there.
were all, of course, invaded many times and outright ruled by the British Empire in parts for nearly 2 centuries between 1757 and 1947. Nepal was invaded in 1814 but never successfully conquered. Bhutan was invaded in 1772 and again in 1864 and was sort of conquered as a protectorate between 1910 and 1948. Burma/Myanmar was invaded in 1826 and was definitely successfully conquered and ruled through 1947. Thailand was briefly invaded in 1945 since they were allied to Japan in World War II, and so was Vietnam in the same year, but that was to support the French government against the growing independence movement. Malaysia and Singapore were each conquered and ruled up until the 1950s and 1960s. Brunei was conquered and ruled up until the 1980s, whereas the Philippines were briefly invaded during the 7 Years' War.
You can understand why in World War II, when Japan is trying to expand outwards, they really don't have much of a choice but to go up against the Allies, right? Like, look at all this territory around them. And if you added in US and French territory, it's basically everything.
China got invaded a lot, and Hong Kong was a colony until as recently as 1997. And while
Yeah, Opium Wars. I mean, not exclusively, but Opium Wars were a big part of that.
not outright invaded, part of Japan was occupied following World War II between 1946 and 1952. And finally, Indonesia was invaded a bunch during the Napoleonic Wars since it was a Dutch colony aligned to France at the time. Next up, Oceania. Australia and New Zealand, of course, were invaded by the British and established as colonies that each gained independence in 1931. Papua New Guinea was also a British colony for a time, as were the island countries of Fiji, Kiribati, the Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. Let's move back over to Africa next, which the British have violently visited a lot. In terms of just places the British outright colonized after invasions, there's the Gambia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Nigeria, Egypt, Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa, along with parts of modern-day Somalia and Guinea. Senegal was briefly invaded and had some of their coastline taken over in the 1700s, while during the Second World War, the British invaded the French colonies of Djibouti, Madagascar, and Comoros after they aligned aligned themselves with the Nazi Vichy regime and the Italian colonies of Libya, Eritrea, and Ethiopia, although they had also invaded Ethiopia much earlier in 1868. And as German colonies right before World War I, the British also invaded Togo and Cameroon without annexing them afterwards. For the final area of the world left to discuss, let's move over to the Americas. All of Canada was a British colony until 1931, while Newfoundland remained until 1949. The United States, of course, was a colony until 1776, and was invaded again in 1812, and the modern states of Oregon and Washington were claimed.
Yeah, those pricks burned down the White House.
Right up until 1846. As far as other outright British colonies here go, there was the Bahamas, Jamaica, Belize, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Barbados, St. Lucia, Dominica, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana. Besides colonies, Cuba was invaded and occupied during the 7 Years' War in 1762. Haiti was invaded in 1793 during the French Revolutionary Wars. The Dominican Republic was invaded way back in 1655 in an attempt at conquest under Oliver Cromwell. Parts of the east coast of Honduras and Nicaragua were conquered and ruled for nearly 2 centuries until 1819. They sent the Navy to invade Mexico in 1861 to force them to repay some debts, and during the splendidly named War of Jenkins' Year, aka the more lame-sounding War of the Austrian Succession, the British invaded a lot of Spain's colonies, including Panama, a huge one into Colombia, and ultimately Peru. In 1796, the British took over Suriname because it was a Dutch colony, and
that's what I was going to say. Throughout this time period, specifically the later 1600s to the 1800s, if you look at the major powers at the time, the whole world is covered. I mean, literally the whole world, because if you go into South America, that's Spanish. That's Spanish territory. Spanish territories in Central America, Mexico. French and British territory, and even Spanish in the United States, in the continental U.S. today. The British have, obviously, Canada. You go over to Europe, like literally the major powers run everything in that time period. And it's why I think if you were a country that was looking to explode onto the scene around the 1600s time period, a lot of those countries still had the mindset that the expansion was going to happen on the ground. And while that's true to some extent, I think really the ones that were ahead of the curve on this were the ones who realized the expansion was going to be by sea. So you have it's happenstance in some situations. Not everybody sees it coming. But if you expand the Navy, if it becomes more of a exploration, trade destination, and you start having this country and economy that's built on naval expansion versus military expansion by land, then when this era opens up, basically the whole world is open to you. And so then when you look at a map of the time period, you're like, wow, half a dozen powers basically control the world.
They were allied with the revolutionary French and later Napoleon. They also invaded Martinique and Guadeloupe because they actually were French during the Napoleonic Wars. Venezuela was invaded in 1902 as part of the so-called Venezuela crisis to force the country to repay some debts they had defaulted on, kind of like Mexico.
Yeah, France still has territory over here. I don't know if everybody knows this, but the Louisiana Purchase that gets like a third of the continental United States, gets it to the U.S. government. That was Napoleon. That was facilitated and done with under the Napoleonic government.
While Argentina and Uruguay were both invaded during the Napoleonic Wars as well in 1806, when Spain and her colonies were still allied with Napoleon. And that pretty much sums up all of the territory the British have ever ruled and all of the countries this small island has ever invaded. There are a total of 65 countries today who celebrate their independence days from the British Empire.
That part is crazy. That part. The fact that they invaded, controlled, and then had to basically be pushed out of that many countries. That's the part that's crazy to me. That many countries celebrate their independence from Britain. Hell, in the U.S., we celebrate our independence July 4th. That's from Britain.
The empire used to rule over a quarter of all the world's land at the same time and was the biggest empire in human history. And in total, today, there have been 117 modern countries that have been aggressively invaded by the British Armed Forces during some point in their histories, representing a total of 60% of all the world's nations, which is almost the same number of countries that you can watch this video in. YouTube is available in 130 countries now, or about 2/3 of them, but the algorithm that YouTube uses.
Okay, so that was every country England has invaded visualized. This was interesting. I'm not throwing stones at the British Empire here. You know, context is everything for history. You can slant anything one way or another. But I was surprised at, you know, obviously, I know how big the British Empire was, at least like theoretically. But again, when I saw the numbers for it the other day and how many countries celebrate their independence, I was just like, damn, that seems like so many. Yeah, that's a lot of the world. That's a lot of the world. I would love to do, I'm going to see if I can find another one of these on, again, one of those major empires that from the 16 through 1800s. To see kind of a compare and contrast for, you know, what each one looks like in their heyday. But that was every country England has invaded, visualized. Good video. If you have any other recommendations for videos I should check out, you can put them down in the comments below. You can also put it in the Discord. I'll put the link down below in the description box for the Discord. There's a page on there for YouTube recommendations. I'll see either one. So just throw it out there. I'll put it down and get a chance to look at it and do a reaction to it. Also, I'm working on a couple of things. I've got a series coming up on Swedish Armed Forces. I've got one that's the Franco-Prussian War I just started. I'm also working on getting the first part of The Big Short out. I couldn't do it through YouTube. It got denied and denied and denied over and over for YouTube. So I was trying to figure out another way around it. I think I have figured out a way. I'm going to use YouTube as the medium, but the actual reaction is going to be through a Google Doc that you can find on the actual, you know, video when you click on YouTube. So all of that stuff should be out soon. But with that being said, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. I will see you all next time.